Assalamu alaikum and heartfelt greetings to all who have tuned in. I'm Sana, your representative for the Pakistani Students Association Coalition on this momentous evening. I'm elated to welcome each and every one of you to a third and indeed pivotal session of our intellectually invigorating dialogue series. Before we dive into today's highly anticipated session, I'd likely briefly touch upon the essence of the PSA Coalition. The coalition's inception is a testament to our President Arif Shahid's vision, a vision of unity, intellectual rigor, and meaningful conversations for Pakistani students spread across the length and breadth of the United States. A heartfelt thanks to our diligent coalition board for meticulously curating and organizing these dialogues that are nothing short of nourishment. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have the extraordinary privilege of hosting an academic luminary, Professor Hafsa Kanjwal, currently gracing Lafayette College as an assistant professor of South Asian history. She earned her PhD in history and women's studies from the esteemed University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Her body of work transcends academia. Professor Kanjwal has been an indomitable voice on Kashmir, contributing sagacious perspectives to prominent publications like the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, and Foreign Policy magazine, to mention a few. She has even illuminated global audiences through her appearances on Al Jazeera English's The Stream and Inside Story. The cornerstone for tonight's discourse is her groundbreaking book, Colonizing Kashmir, State Building Under Indian Occupation. In a world where Kashmir often becomes a mere footnote in geopolitical tensions, this book is not just timely, but indispensable. It offers a meticulously researched critique of state formation in Kashmir, serving as a cornerstone for understanding the underlying complexities and injustices that continue to plague the region today. I invite Professor Hafsa Kanjwal to elaborate on this seminal work, to delve into these critical arguments, the complex journey of its creation, and its far-reaching implications on the present issue of Kashmir. Professor Hafsa, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sana, for such a kind and generous invitation. And thank you also to the PSA Coalition for inviting me to participate. I'm very excited to speak to all of you today. So I'll be talking about my book, Colonizing Kashmir, which just came out last month. But before I do, I wanted to share a bit about what's currently going on in Kashmir, just so that you can put my book in a bigger context. So many of you might remember that in August 2019, India embarked on the next phase of its settler colonial project in Indian-occupied Kashmir. And it's not an exaggeration to say that for the past 4 years, Kashmiris have been effectively silenced as India has changed a series of laws that allow its citizens and armed forces to buy land and settle in the region in order to change the demographics. And the idea behind changing the demographics is to make sure that Indian settlers come in and kind of overpower the Muslim majority numerically so that India can, in maybe not 5, maybe not 10, but 20, 25 years, say that, you know, there's no dispute here. All of these people want to remain with India. And this is all kind of happening as geopolitics is realigning with the United States, heavily relying on India now to counter China, and other states in the region, including Israel, the United Arab Emirates, getting involved in India's settler colonial project as well. In recent years, the government has basically gone over all forms of dissent. When 2019 happened, many of you may remember there was a complete communication clampdown. A number of Kashmir's pro-freedom leadership were basically arrested, or many of them eventually died in jail. But in addition to that, writers, journalists, artists, academics, human rights defenders, and activists have also been affected in a number of ways. Just last month, Kashmiri journalists and activists had their passports revoked. So basically, writing or saying anything that portrays the Indian government's actions in a negative light is a cause of harassment and interrogation. So it's a very, very difficult time in Kashmir. Most people there feel quite hopeless because not only has any kind of space to express their dissent been completely annihilated, but also it seems that the international community or people around the world have also forgotten about their plight or are not really doing enough to share knowledge about what's happening. So my hope with this book is that it can kind of situate a longer history of India's rule in Kashmir. And part of this is because the Indian state, because of its effective soft power, but also because of the strength of its diaspora in the US, which is very strong in the government, the academy, as well as the media, has been able to craft a particular narrative about Kashmir to the international community. And so research and scholarship has kind of emerged as one space where many academics, including academics mostly of Kashmiri descent, have been trying to do the work, whether it's anthropological or archival in my case, to really contest some of these narratives that have framed how the world sees Kashmir. So my book basically looks at one decade, from 1953 to 1963, when a man named Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad was in power in Kashmir as the second prime minister. And at this time, Kashmir had already been divided between India and Pakistan following the first India-Pakistan war from 1947 to 1948. And the UN had already called for a plebiscite to be held in the region once hostilities had ceased so that Kashmiris could determine their future. And so my research is in the part of Kashmir, which includes Ladakh, the Kashmir Valley, and Jammu, that became a part of, or that was basically occupied by India during this time. But for the most part, I focus on the Kashmir Valley because that's where the government, both the Indian government and the Kashmir government, was really actively trying to integrate the Muslims of that region. So right from 1947, India colonized the part of Kashmir that was under its rule. It placed its own client regimes in power and basically negotiated some level of autonomy with them, which was enshrined in something called Article 370. And the article itself was a colonial treaty. It was meant to placate Kashmiris into thinking that being under Indian rule would be for their own benefit. And under this article, which is what was revoked in 2019, Kashmir was able to have its own prime minister, its own lawmaking body, and the leader of the state was even called the prime minister. But Sheikh Abdullah, who was the first prime minister, he had initially agreed to Kashmir's accession to India, and he began to backtrack. And he realized that India was actually not interested in granting Kashmiris their autonomy. So in 1953, he was removed in a coup, and he was replaced by his deputy, Bakshi, who's the man that I largely centered the book around. So a little bit about the journey of this book. When I began my PhD research a decade ago, and I was just looking at the literature, especially the historical literature on Kashmir, I really found a lot of information, of course, around partition and what happened around partition and the contesting narratives. But then there was also another body of work on the late 1980s and the rise of the armed rebellion and the mass popular uprising that began in Kashmir. And most of this literature was narrated through an Indian statist lens. And the Kashmiri struggle for liberation in this narrative was always framed as secessionism or, of course, terrorism. And Kashmiris have always contested these narratives. And there have been many writers, novelists, academics who have tried to shift how we think about the past 70 years. But I found that the years between 1947 and the 1980s, there was really very little written about that time period. And so that's why I was drawn to that period. And oftentimes the way that this period is depicted is that things were normal, which means that there wasn't the violence that you would see emerging after the 1980s and the armed rebellion and the intense militarization that the region was subject to. And so there's kind of this assumption, broader assumption that things were fine, or India was slowly trying to integrate Kashmiris, and it was only because either on the one hand, because of Pakistan's interference, or another reason that's given is because India failed to uphold its own kind of democratic values, that things in Kashmir basically went in the other direction. So, but my book actually looks at how the decade that Bakshi was in power in the 50s and the 60s actually consolidated India's colonial occupation. And it relied on things like development, secularism, democracy, and empowerment, which in other spaces look like they're positive things, right? But this is precisely how Kashmir became colonized. And I historicize India's occupation. I show that it looked different in this time period in comparison to what happened in the late 1980s with the brutal militarization, but it was still very much invested in denying Kashmiris their sovereignty or their self-determination. And basically, in these early years, the Indian government saw the Kashmir issue on economic terms and not in terms of a political struggle or a question of sovereignty. And they felt that as long as Kashmiris were shown that being under India was good for them, that they would eventually be okay with what was going on politically, and they would eventually come to accept India. So both governments, basically the Indian government as well as the Kashmir client regimes, thought that Kashmiris' sentiments could be managed through state planning. And they tried to show Kashmiris the many benefits that they could incur under Indian rule that was not possible under any other kind of political setup, but also that was not granted to Indian states in the mainland. And one of the kind of theoretical things that I talk about in the book is something called the politics of life. And this basically means how the government propagated development, empowerment, and progress to secure the well-being of Kashmir's population and also to normalize the occupation for multiple audiences. And it meant foregrounding things like employment, food, education, and the provision of basic services. And yet again, at the same time, questions of self-determination and Kashmir's political future were actively being suppressed. One thing that I found in my research is that this was actually not just the plan of the local government, but it went to the straight higher ups of the Indian government. The first Indian Prime Minister, Nehru, basically once said that India would bind Kashmir in golden chains. And that's precisely what it did in these decades. And the hope was that Kashmiri Muslim sentiments would shift then in favor of India. So the reason why this period that I'm looking at is important is that when we look at the colonial settings or colonial contexts, the common understanding is often that these are places of immense dispossession, violence, war, and marginalization. And of course, many times there are, especially with what happened in Kashmir in the late 1980s and onwards. But then only seeing colonialism as being defined by violence or outward violence, it erases our understandings of the other ways that colonialism can take place, many times through things like giving, development, and empowerment. And this is precisely what defined the early decades of India's rule. The other main point is that scholars of settler colonialism also argue that not all states eliminate subjects just by killing them off or by driving them off the land. The elimination can also occur by assimilation, or what I call integration in the book, where the idea is to basically rid the people of their own sense of history and identity and bring them into line with the state and with a new identity. So the different chapters in the book basically look at the different ways that India's occupation operated. I look at things like international diplomacy, film, tourism, education, economic development, and cultural reform. For example, chapter 3 looks at how both Indian film and tourism to Kashmir sought to produce these Indian colonial desires and claims over the occupied territory. Some of you may know, or maybe your parents or grandparents used to watch many of these films like Kashmir Ki Kali and many others that were filmed in Kashmir at that time. And another chapter looks at economic development and basically how India provided the Kashmir state with many grants that it would not provide to states in India, and also rice subsidies. So basically flooding Kashmir with rice so that people could kind of be, the idea was to integrate them gastronomically. And this was actually a word that was used by one of the policymakers that I looked at. And of course, part of this is also the creation of a collaborator class, because once you start giving in funds and money and development, you create a class of people that is then economically tied to the colonial state and become a part of that state apparatus, which is also what makes it very difficult then for people who live under that colonial control to separate themselves from it. But I don't want to go too much into the ending, but I show how this project basically backfired, and that even though Bakshi tried to politically and economically and socially integrate Kashmiris into India, the decades following his rule actually saw some of the most massive popular uprisings for self-determination in Kashmir. So even though the chains were golden, it did not mean that people did not still try to break them. And finally, I hope that the book is, of course, about Kashmir, but I also hope that people who live in other parts of the world that continue to live under different types of colonization or settler colonialism can benefit from it. Kashmir, I noticed as I was doing my research, is really not an exception. There's a number of other communities or peoples that have been brought into the fold of the nation state without their consent. And so the ways in which the nation state tries to deal with these different places differs. But one thing that I'm kind of trying to show is that it's through things like development and empowerment and the politics of life that that the state also tries to manage people in these settings. But of course, people can and they have continued to resist. So yeah, I think that's all kind of a broad overview about the book, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Kanjwal, for that compelling and comprehensive overview. Now, let's bring to the spotlight our adept moderator for the evening, Abdullah Bali. He's currently an instructor at Queen's College. Abdullah's academic portfolio is enriched by a deep focus on political science and international law. His insights into the politics, society, and nuances of the South Asia, fortified by his attention to minority issues, makes him the ideal steward for tonight's cerebral expedition. Abdullah, the stage now is yours. We are eager for the intellectual feast that's about to unfold.
Thank you, Sana. First things first, I just want to thank you, Professor Kanjwal, for coming in. It was a real pleasure to read your book. I personally have to thank you as well, as a person whose family came from Jammu, whose family fled and escaped the 1947 massacres. I was really touched by the fact that you focused on their plight in your book, and you focused on what actual developments were happening on a local level, on a people's level. I really, really could not have found a better description of the general situation in any of the current media. Unfortunately, it seems there is very little focus on the historical issues and more focus on the sensationalist aspect of the conflict, and that seems to occur in many parts of the world. But right now, I just want to address that issue in particular before we go any further, because I was curious about what you would what you would talk about. This is not the first time that Kashmir has seen this sort of hemorrhaging of its population. We've seen another one occur in 1990, and obviously the last one to occur was in 1947. But it's not the first time Kashmir has ever experienced that. There was also times in the Mughal period, the Maratha period, and then even into the British period where Shias, Sufis, and even some Hindu communities, some Sikh communities were also expelled from Kashmir. And typically you saw a similar reason. Outside forces came into Kashmir. They started pressuring the leadership. They scapegoated a minority, and then that minority ended up being expelled or was forced to leave. What's different about this particular situation. Obviously, the popular sentiment has something to do with it. This is the first time Kashmir has experienced some degree of popular sovereignty in many centuries. It's not complete, but what aspects of it did you notice that are unique to this case in particular?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I mean, this is kind of one of the things about history is that it often repeats itself, and sometimes we forget that it does repeat itself. And sometimes when I shared earlier that people in Kashmir are feeling quite hopeless, right? They feel that things are not going to change or improve and that it's very difficult to move forward and try to find a way out of this current predicament. Sometimes I will kind of remind them, well, our ancestors lived under the Dogras, who were extremely violent, especially towards Kashmir's Muslims. And at that time, Kashmiri Muslims were broadly and largely illiterate. Only 1% of the population was what they would call literate at that time. And that's also what saw so many Kashmiris then moving to places in Punjab. And that's why you have these communities of Kashmiri descent or ancestry living in Pakistan today. That's kind of an earlier migration. So yeah, no, there's definitely like things that kind of continue to repeat themselves. But I think what kind of changes in the situation is that this might be, at least with the modern nation state, the post-colonial nation state, the way that it operates is a bit different from earlier types of empires and other forms of rule. Like its sovereignty is almost like very absolute, and it has other techniques and resources it can use, like advanced surveillance and technology that also kind of get involved in people's private lives or their day-to-day lives to a much higher extent than it might have in the past. And so I think Kashmiris have probably faced land dispossession and ethnic cleansing and genocide. They have faced it in the past. They faced it in 1947 in Jammu. And that's why Jammu was a Muslim majority region, but now it's a Hindu majority, and oftentimes that whole history of Muslims living there is erased. But I think in this time, the ways that geopolitics is kind of taking shape, in 1947, it's possible that Pakistan was a bulwark against some of the actions of the Indian state could potentially take, especially with the United Nations and the call for a plebiscite and during the Cold War. But now it seems that there's very little to stop India from completely taking over Kashmiri land and dispossessing people of their homes, and kind of making Muslims a minority in that region in its entirety. So I think that's what the fear is with this moment. But that's not to say that people in the past were not also subject to, intense levels of dispossession and violence.
Okay, that's intriguing because the aspect of modern technological surveillance and then obviously mass internment and the sorts of repression that we're seeing now are a first. But it wasn't the only thing that it wasn't the only attempt India tried at trying to appeal to Kashmiris. Obviously, the rule of Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad that you described is essentially bread and circus. The idea of trying to appeal to general feelings of contentment, personally speaking, and providing some degree of entertainment that distracts from the severe repression or the severe societal problems that are existing in the background. Why didn't that work in Kashmir? I'm aware, obviously, from the book that there is a political will that existed and it was fomented in response to the oppressive Dogra rule. But the policy of bread and circus lasted well after Bakshi's term ended, and the insurgency and the brutality did not begin until the 90s. So why did it not work over a multi-generation experiment? Why didn't it succeed?
Sorry, why the kind of the politics of life didn't succeed?
Yeah,
Well, I
politics.
think so. India continues to use the politics of life in different ways. It'll find kind of new populations. Even today, there will be new groups of people, new classes of people that it tries to incite through corruption and giving them certain benefits into, into serving as collaborators. But I think part of what I'm trying to look at in the book is that in different moments, different modalities of control are foregrounded. So in this period, in the period before the 90s, it was this the use of the politics of life. And later on, it became what academics call a lot more necropolitical, meaning it was about death, right? Bare life with so many killings and enforced disappearances and mass graves and so on. I think the Hindutva angle also plays an important role where under liberal secular Indian governments, their sentiment was that Muslims in Kashmir could be integrated to India. And part of it was also how they saw Kashmiri Muslims. They didn't see them as being Muslim enough. They saw them as being influenced by Sufism, which kind of had tamed in their mind the impact of Islam in Kashmir, in the valley specifically. And so they saw Kashmiri Muslims as people who could be integrated into this kind of broader Indian secular project. But Hindutva really doesn't have those kinds of concerns. They're not interested in integrating Kashmiri Muslims into the state. They are trying to, in many ways, dispossess them or overpower them and bring on this demographic change. Kashmiris were always worried about demographic change, even in the 1940s and 50s. That's why Article 370 was even put into place, is because there was always this fear of Indian settlers coming in. But for whatever reason, the Indian government did not decide to kind of foreground that mode of control in the past. But now they are shifting kind of more towards that. So perhaps like this shift between liberal forms of rule versus this Hindutva form of rule also plays a role in your question.
Yeah, it's possible, but when it comes to Hindu nationalist organizations, obviously they didn't tolerate all of them. So one of them, obviously the one you mentioned, one of them, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, was banned in the aftermath of partition, but it wasn't because of their work in Kashmir. It was in retaliation to the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. When it came to other organizations, I think you mentioned one called the Praja Parishad in the book. They were consistently hostile to the common Kashmiris, who you also mentioned were an underclass, and that class conflict was further emboldened by the religious segregation that existed under the Dogras and to some degree continued under successive governments post-independence. So they were catering to an elite class of Hindus, the Praja Parishad and other Hindutva groups. And this was a region that was supposedly trying to move towards a more egalitarian society, more equitable society, where there are reforms that are focused on improving the situation for common people, and by extension, that more often meant Muslims. And yet, when it came to other landowning elites that may have served certain Muslim interests, Bakshi and the Delhi government bureaucrats were aligned in trying to repress those people, yet they didn't do that for the Hindutva groups. So is that more of is that a difference between liberals and Hindutva? Not really. I don't see it, mainly because I think that the liberals were not concerned about democratization as much as they were about forcing Indian control over Kashmir. Do you have any objection to that, or do you think there's anything I'm missing here?
No, I think that's fair.
Okay. Well, beyond that, beyond simply just trying to gain control of Kashmir, obviously you mentioned that they weren't trying to they were trying to portray Kashmiri Muslims as not being Muslim enough by emphasizing things like the Rishi order in contrast to other orders like the Hamdani order that existed in Kashmir for a very long time. So beyond that, what kind of effects did this have Islamically on Kashmir? So obviously, this is a supposedly secular democratic government that's trying to erase the distinct religious identities, create a more syncretic one. You mentioned the uh, the constructed Kashmiriyat idea in the book. So what kind of impact is this having on religious values and on the Islamic aspect of Kashmiri society?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I didn't, to be honest, like the book doesn't really go into like people's own Islam, like Islamic values or Islamic practices, because I was more interested in these different modalities of control. I am actually hoping to look more into Islam and the role that it played, especially since the early 20th century in Kashmir, in a second book project. But what I can say is that, and in some ways, many Kashmiri elites, political and economic elites, actually internalize these discourses of some kind of distinct Kashmiri Muslim identity that was kind of a lot more open than its neighbors and more open than Muslims elsewhere. So there is that part. But then at the same time, there was growing movements, different groups like the Jamaat-e-Islami that emerged, especially in the 1950s and 1960s, which were trying to contest the secular aims or the secularization aims of Kashmir's Muslims at this time. And so the Jamaat played a much bigger role in politics after the decade that I discuss. But in the time that I'm looking at, they actually were the ones that were opening up schools, especially in rural areas, and kind of trying to inculcate those values amongst Kashmir's Muslims. So I think that then also kind of creates, like many other Muslim societies around the world, you have multiple groups, both state and non-state, that are attempting to shape people's religious perspectives and religious identities. And you kind of today also you see elements of that in Kashmir today. And it's not just the Jamaat, there's also the Ahlul Hadith and other kind of more reformist groups as well.
Okay. So, yep. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. So yeah, I appreciate you trying to go into in depth. I apologize if that wasn't like focused specifically on the book. It was just something I was curious about because obviously I knew the book didn't go into full context. I just wondered if you had anything else you could expand on that. But I appreciate the further information. Thank you. But another thing that I wanted to ask is the policies that were pushed by the Indian government were with respect to Kashmir's identity. Did it have any actual precedent? Because it obviously when you're forming a national identity, if it's formed on something flimsy, it's going to fizzle out within the next few years. But Kashmiriyat as an ideology has continued to persist. Is there actually something genuine in that we can see and consider as a potential unifying factor, or is it just all artificial?
That's a good question. So the term Kashmiriyat actually didn't even enter the discourse in Kashmir until the 70s, when it was popularized by Sheikh Abdullah again once he comes into power. And I think part of what looking into, like in terms of cultivation of an identity, is that sure, Kashmir had a very rich multi-religious, multicultural history. But there were also deep inequalities between Kashmir's religious groups because of issues of caste and class. And Kashmiri Pandits in particular had significant societal privilege over Kashmiri Muslims under multiple rulers, right? Even before the Dogras. So to say, the discourse of Kashmiriyat makes it seem as if everyone got along fine until more kind of Muslim assertions entered the political field in Kashmir. And that's what is problematic about that discourse. But what's also problematic is that the fact that Kashmir had different religious groups or that there were different cultures that somehow means that it should have been a part of India. That's the link, or that's the jump that that discourse of Kashmiriyat also tries to push forward. So there's two things. One is that just because Kashmir is multi-religious, multicultural, doesn't mean that it should have gone to India. The second is that what are these hierarchies within Kashmir's religious groups, as well as what are Kashmir's Muslim histories, right? So even like narratives about Kashmir's identity, and it's, how Kashmir was founded, or like the story of Kashmir, the history of Kashmir, it relied heavily on Sanskrit texts and Sanskrit mythologies. And oftentimes Muslim rulers, Muslim periods of rule, even the reasons why many of Kashmir's indigenous populations converted to Islam, that was erased. So I think it's not entirely accurate in terms of how they were trying to construct a Kashmiri identity, because it erases an entire like history and legacy, because that then does not fit so easily into the Indian national project. So yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so when it comes to constructing the identity, it was to some degree, it was some degree a flimsy premise, but the overall general idea, they tried to squeeze in as much of authenticity as possible, but it seems to have not worked. Am I getting the basic gist of it?
Yeah.
Okay. So if that did not succeed, if I can just focus on the part of the history that you did focus on, Bakshi's premiership. You mentioned he used to hand out jobs left and right so he could ensure employment. You mentioned, I don't know if you mentioned it humorously, but you mentioned a incident where he met a bunch of high school graduate boys, and he told them all to go and report to duty the next day. He just assigned them roles just like that, and naturally that meant that bureaucracy was overstacked, and most of the revenue was from state enterprises. The industries that were being boasted about in Delhi were not effective. Output was poor. They bragged about development compared to Pakistan's side of Kashmir, but a lot of it was not genuine. And so overall, it did tighten his control over Kashmir, though, which is what allowed for the facade of stability and control of the opposition and the supposed law and order. And one can assume that that was what facilitated the backlash that existed after Bakshi was overthrown. The years of repression naturally would have caused a lot of the political opposition to radicalize to some extent or to become more vocal. So overall, in that time period you discussed, was there anything tangible that was achieved, whether it was developmental or social, or regarding social reforms or economically speaking? Was there anything tangible that was earned by Bakshi's premiership?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what the politics of life initiates is that there are some tangible benefits. So, of course, a lot of people got educated, right? So, Kashmiri Muslims, for example, before 1947, as I mentioned earlier, were largely illiterate. And so hundreds of thousands of people are now attending school, women are attending school, and medical schools and engineering schools were also opened up. And so that creates like a professional class of Muslims as well. But then, of course, the question there is, as many of the people who are dissenting against the secular reforms in education at this time, is what exactly are they teaching the people, right? So what, yes, schools are being open, but what is the intent of education for Kashmiri Muslims at this time? And how is it aligned with India's larger project in Kashmir? So, no, there is a lot of wealth that's then created that creates a middle class during this time. But it also creates, again, what I mentioned earlier, like some form of economic dependency to the Indian government. And that then also entrenches like these divisions or these different factions within Kashmir.
All right. So I suppose education would be the biggest significant factor that we can attribute to the Indian government, and for creating, to some degree, a professional middle class would be a benefit. But again, because of the lack of industry there, I don't think that it can actually turn out any useful results, because one of the biggest complaints in Kashmir, again, is the poor output when it comes to industry and when it comes to the private sector. So whether or not that actually helps is something to have a little bit of skepticism on, I would think, because, and this isn't about Kashmir specifically, this is a problem throughout India, but I suppose that's a different discussion.
Yeah, and part of, sorry, just to add, part of the intention was also to kind of create this overinflated bureaucratic class. So even today, most Kashmiris have some sort of alignment with government bureaucracy, which again makes resistance very difficult. But now, when we talk about the shifts, what's changing now is that even those who are in government employment, they face losing that government employment because the Indian government wants to replace many of those Kashmiri Muslims in different levels of bureaucracy with Indian settlers. So that's, again, the shift that's happening in this moment.
Right. And oh, it looks like we might have, okay, we have 5 more minutes before we go into Q&As, I believe. So I'll try to ask questions that I think would be rather decisive, like they would give like a good way to end it off before we move on to the next segment. First, like just as a general review of a gist of what happened in the lead up to the insurgency. India made an allegiance with a modernist Muslim who then became a Marxist, then threw him out after Sheikh Abdullah retracted his support for accession. And then following that, they propped up a corrupt bureaucrat who stacked up the civil service, repressed dissent, and maintained a facade of development. And he engendered loyalty through nepotism. And then they sentenced him guilty when he was no longer of use, and then propped up a chief minister who further eroded Kashmir's autonomy. And then India gradually adopted a narrative of Kashmiri incompetence and poverty when it convenienced them regarding their economy, and then over-romanticized them to foreign tourists, which angered the local population. Eventually, after years of repression, they took to arms demanding devolution of power to them. And as a result, India has now gone on an even heavier-handed approach, repressing dissidents and with horrible accounts of mass rapes and mass shootings and things of that nature. And now, after a decade of insurgency that may have been supported by Pakistan, the Indian government is now embarking on settler colonialism, eroding everything that remains of the Kashmiri identity and making it essentially a client state. And so, taking all of that in, why has there not been any general, like widespread attempt in India, any sizable attempt to hold the government accountable for its failures? Because we talk monumentally about the problems Kashmir faces when it comes to radicalism, when it comes to backwardness, when it comes to social inhibition, but we don't talk about the heavy-handed mismanagement of the Indian government, its bigotry towards Kashmiris, or its indifference to human life there. Why does no one talk about the government's policies and implement any change within India itself? Why is there no call for that?
Yeah, I mean, part of the answer to that is that a lot of this project was not just directed towards Kashmiri Muslims, it was also directed towards people in the Indian mainland. So if you spend decades basically saying Kashmir is an integral part of India, Kashmir is an integral part of India, you spend all of this money there, you develop a pretty sophisticated tourism industry, you make all of these films that feature Indian film stars coming to Kashmir. It creates this desire for Kashmir within the Indian population. And that desire is incredibly, incredibly strong. Any Indian that I meet, especially of a certain age, they'll first say, oh, Kashmir, it's so beautiful. And oh, but the terrorists are there, but not anymore because Modi ji has taken care of them. That's how they understand Kashmir. 1, it's really beautiful. It's part of our land. 2, the terrorists are ruining it. Pakistan is ruining it. And 3, but now Modi ji has come to fix it. That's like your very typical Indian kind of mainstream understanding of what's happening in Kashmir. And so then within that mindset, it's going to be very hard to find like pockets of any kind of resistance. Whatever pockets existed, still situated the Kashmir issue within a human rights frame. So Indian progressives, however few of them there are, or liberals or human rights activists in India, for the most part, with some notable exceptions, most of them still would kind of say, like, we need to be better in how we deal with Kashmir. Like, yes, this is still a part of India, but we just need to be better with them. We shouldn't be like shooting them with pellet guns, and we shouldn't be raping them, etc. And our army should kind of tone back the level of violence. And so that, of course, also doesn't get to the heart of what is going on there and what the people there are demanding or wanting. And now it's so difficult to find even pockets of those people who can even just basically talk about like basic human rights in India, given that the government has completely eradicated dissent in Kashmir, but also across India. So different human rights defenders, activists, they're all targeted. Many of them are in jail today, right? So the cost of dissent, wherever it may exist, is very high. And otherwise, there's an immense amount of propaganda, media, and just basically propaganda that's invested in making sure that Indians see Kashmir in a very particular way.
All right.
Thank you, Professor Kanjwal and Abdullah, for the enlightening dialogue that has undoubtedly left us all with much to ponder. Now, as we approach the final segment of our evening, we'd like to open the floor for a Q&A session from our esteemed audience. Please feel free to ask your questions, and let's keep this wave of intellectual curiosity flowing. We have really good questions, but unfortunately, due to the time constraint, I will not be able to take all of them. However, I will be taking around 2 or 3 questions. The first question is by Ikra. What role can the Kashmiri diaspora and the South Asian diaspora more broadly play in influencing the discourse around the state building and occupation in Kashmir?
Sure. So, the Kashmiri diaspora from Indian occupied Kashmir in primarily the US and the UK, although of course there's a lot more from Azad Kashmir in the UK, they have tried, especially since the 90s, but also starting in the 70s, to play an important role in trying to reveal what India has been up to in Kashmir. But they're vastly, vastly outnumbered by the Indian diaspora that has a lot more resources and basically power at its fingertips. And so after 2019, you saw a bit of mobilization in different cities. So there was like massive protests, and of course the Pakistani diaspora and Muslim groups and other kind of allies played a role in kind of raising awareness with what was happening in Kashmir at that time. But a lot of that has died down, and specifically within the Kashmiri diaspora, there's fears because the Indian state has become so repressive that people who are active abroad, many of them fear that they won't be able to go back. Their families there in Kashmir are being harassed and interrogated. So it makes it very difficult, given the transnational nature of Indian state repression, as well as the Hindutva lobbies in the US, to do any kind of activism on Kashmir. But I still think that doesn't mean that we have to stop and kind of just give up, because I think young South Asians of all different political backgrounds and perspectives can really play an important role in educating themselves and trying to organize events or campaigns based on either their universities or their place of work, etc. There are like pockets where India's state narrative can be kind of like poked. It is very strong in the US, but that doesn't mean that there aren't different ways to poke it, right? So especially because I'm speaking to mostly all college students here, if there are any connections that your universities have to the Indian state, or people that are brought in that have problematic views, or, just even like raising awareness on social media and talking about this is a big deal, because right now Kashmiris in Kashmir feel that they can't speak because the cost of that is too high, and it means a lot to them for people outside to raise this in different platforms, whatever it may be. At this point, just like not allowing Indian state's normalization of the occupation to flourish is really the most we can do. And of course, hopefully with time, people can organize better and have much more significant, long-lasting campaigns and advocacy as well.
Thank you so much. As a professor yourself, and also for coming here and, just engaging in this wonderful session. Another question by Mubashara. So in regards from the South Asian, given your contributions to various news outlets, how do you view the role of media in shaping the discourse on Kashmir? Is it an enabler, a hindrance, or a mixed bag?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say it's a mixed bag. And just taking 2019 and what happened since then as an example, the media, much of the international media actually relies on the hard work of Kashmiri journalists who are kind of stringers, or they work for these different international media outlets. And for so long, it was so important, the kind of documentation that they did, just in terms of the different human rights violations and what India has been up to in Kashmir. And so media has played a role in at least just kind of disrupting this narrative that everything is fine in Kashmir. At the same time, much of the media coverage doesn't get to the heart of what is at stake with the Kashmir issue. It again kind of frames it either as a territorial dispute between India and Pakistan. Kashmiri anti-colonial resistance is still depicted as either like militant fundamentalism or secessionism, separatism, etc. And it also doesn't get to the root causes of why Kashmiris are resisting, or why they haven't adopted or accepted Indian rule. So it is a bit of a mixed bag. But now I think the media will play. It's going to get even more complicated. Just to give you one very quick example, a couple of days ago, the BBC did a story, a very simple, basic story about how journalism has been quashed in Kashmir. And they interviewed journalists, all of them anonymously because nobody wanted to give their own name. And the Jammu Kashmir police basically put out a statement saying that this is all lies. Like, the BBC is telling all lies, none of this is true. And as a result, journalists in Kashmir were probably brought in, from what I'm hearing, that they were brought in for additional questioning and harassed if they may have played a role in helping out with that story. So the stakes of the media have also gotten really intense, and it's going to become harder to even just do that basic reporting on Kashmir. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but continued media attention, even if it's not perfect, is really important.
Thank you so much. And we will be taking one more question, the second last. So two people asked that, what do you think that the UN could have done differently during the mediation to prevent the conflict that arose in Kashmir? And a follow-up question from Ahmed Ibrahim is, in your opinion, what are some of the potential pathways for hopefully a peaceful resolution in Kashmir?
This is a complicated question because I'm not sure that any kind of resolution is possible within the current liberal nation state order. And in some ways, the activities of the UN, even though it called for a plebiscite, and that remains in many ways for many Kashmiris really important, like an important legal context for their struggle. But I guess one thing that I want to say is that what the UN says or does, even though Kashmiris have used it strategically, it's not the only thing giving Kashmiris their right to sovereignty and self-determination that exists outside of any kind of UN resolution, because all people should have that, and many have gotten to exercise it, and so why shouldn't the Kashmiris be allowed to? The second is that in many ways the UN actually entrenched the occupation further because of its 5 veto states. So one of the things that I talk about in my second chapter is how India was basically, and the Bakshi regime was able to kind of bring the Soviet Union, which had veto power at the UN, into its ambit. And so at any kind of future resolutions or discussions on Kashmir, the Soviets always sided with India. And so just the fact that like there are these different nation states and they kind of belong to different power blocks, like people like the Kashmiris and many other kind of communities that continue to live under colonization will never be benefited from those systems. It will be very difficult for them to. So I think part of what I think is important is to kind of, even though this is a long way coming, but to think a lot more strategically about how we need to think of solutions beyond the current liberal international order, which is built on nation states, which just by nature of their existence suppress groups of people like Kashmiris.
Thank you, everyone, for such thoughtful questions that have undoubtedly enriched tonight's discussion. I wish we had more time to explore each and every question in depth, but unfortunately, we have reached to the point where we have to take our last question for the evening. For the final question of the evening, Professor Kanjwal, could you tell us about the long-term implications of your research? How can we apply the understanding gleaned from your work in the book and your research to foster a more nuanced and actionable discourse about the Kashmir's future?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that part of like what the book does is it like allows people to have the knowledge, the resources to understand exactly how this colonial project took shape and how it's developed, which I think can help like mediate or at least address some of the narratives that you see from the Indian side or from security perspectives or even like Western narratives about Kashmir. So I'm hoping that it can kind of serve as a resource that people can use. But then I think kind of a second part is thinking through this question of collaboration. A lot of times in all of our different contexts, in Kashmir is just one, but there's many other moments where, you know, if you try to engage with the system that is oppressing you, the results are not always going to be good. And Kashmiris have unfortunately seen that with these client regimes that thought that they could kind of manage India's rule in Kashmir or try to do something on their own, but they actually further entrenched India's colonial occupation. And so, like, really thinking very critically about engaging and how you engage with systems of oppression. And, you know, I sometimes think like what would have been different it was if India had no takers like Bakshi or even Sheikh Abdullah in Kashmir. What if Kashmiris had just kind of in unison said like, no, absolutely not. We don't want any part in this. We want our freedom. We're demanding our liberation. Things would have looked very differently. So I hope that maybe thinking a little bit about that collaboration angle can be applied in other contexts as well.
Thank you so much, Professor Hafsa, for shedding the light on such intricate matters and for this profoundly informative session. Your research serves as a crucial guide to understanding the nuanced complexities that define Kashmir. We extend our deepest gratitude to you for your invaluable time and insights tonight. Your scholarly acumen has elevated our understandings to new heights, allowing us to explore the multi-layered dynamics of Kashmir with greater depth and clarity. Thank you, Abdullah, for your skillful moderation. Your pointed questions and guidance have made this dialogue both enlightening and highly engaging. As we draw the curtains on tonight's vibrant intellectual gathering, for those who wish to revisit this enriching dialogue or share it with others, we will be uploading tonight's session on our YouTube channel at PSA Coalition. Please subscribe to stay updated on future events and insightful discussions like the one we have had tonight. We have also uploaded our earlier sessions on it. Lastly, thank you everyone for all of your attendance and active participation. It's dialogues like these that enrich our community and foster a culture of critical thinking and empathy towards each other. Until the next installment of our series, stay curious and stay engaged. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Abdullah, for your great questions.
My pleasure.